So, everyone went quiet before I even started, so thank you for that. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. So I'm Professor Sharon Peacock. I'm the Master at Churchill College. And I'm really delighted to have Allen Packwood and General Lord Richard Dannatt here today for the first Masters Book Club session. And in that programme, over time, we're going to celebrate books written by our fellows. So my two guests are authors of the non-fiction book, which you'll see here, Churchill's D-Day, The Inside Story. And I just want to introduce Allen and Richard a little more. So Allen is a fellow of Churchill College and the director of the Churchill Archives Centre. And the centre is a really fantastic resource, which we're privileged to have here in the college. It houses thousands of historic documents and items that anyone can visit and view. Indeed, the book we're discussing today draws on a number of sources from that very archive centre. So General Lord Richard Dannatt was a soldier for 40 years, concluding his military career as Chief of the General Staff. So that's the professional head of the British Army, and as such, he holds incredible expertise in defence and security. And in 2011, Richard became an independent member of the House of Lords. So I'm really looking forward to discussing this book tonight, and we'll be in conversation with Allen and Richard for around 45 minutes, after which we'll have around 10 minutes for a Q&A with you. So with that, I'd like to invite my two guests onto the stage, please. Well, a warm welcome to you. And so I'd like to start by asking you both about how the book came about. I think it's quite an interesting story that actually includes Churchill College, but how it came about and actually what made you want to write it. And so, Richard.
Well, actually, it all started in this room. Autumn 2022, Corelli Barnett, Bill Barnett, your original keeper of the archives, as was then, close neighbour of mine in Norfolk, someone I'd worked with quite a lot in the past, had died, and his family had a memorial seminar here, and the family had asked me to give the eulogy, which I duly did, and was very privileged and pleased to do that. And as Allen walked me out to my car afterwards, he said, I've got a bit of an idea. It's coming up towards the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and I've got a lot of material here in the archives. What about working together on a book about Churchill's D-Day? And that's really where it started.
It is, but I think probably what we'd failed to appreciate at that point as we embraced this concept was that we would have to move incredibly quickly. Because, of course, as soon as we sold this idea to the publisher, they told us, well, it will need to come out for the 80th anniversary of D-Day, 6th of June 2024, which gave us, I think, just over a year to actually produce the book.
Yeah, so you were under pressure to write it pretty quickly, and despite everything else that you do in life.
And of course, it has to start with the central idea. Central idea being Churchill in the Second World War. People think of him much more, his oratory in 1940. But by 1944, the World War had moved on. Britain was not standing alone. He was having to manage the coalition with the Soviet Union and with America, with Stalin and with Roosevelt. So there was many strands that we really needed to examine, and this is what we've tried to do in the book. So Churchill's D-Day is much more about his leadership of the nation within a coalition in 1944, as opposed to never surrender, standing on our own in
I think
1940.
that's a really important point. I mean, I think when people think of Churchill in the Second World War, they tend to think of 1940, they tend to think of Gary Oldman in Darkest Hour. When you think about Churchill when you think about D-Day, Churchill is often absent from the story altogether. The dominant imagery is American GIs storming the beaches, those first few scenes of Saving Private Ryan. And when Churchill does figure in the narrative, when he has been portrayed, it's often been quite negatively. There is a film called Churchill, which came out in 2017 with Brian Cox the actor, not the scientist, playing Winston Churchill. And that film opens with the British Prime Minister walking along a beach and then recoiling, as in his mind's eye, the waves turn red with blood. And the film then goes on to portray him doing everything he can to try and obstruct and stop the D-Day landings with about 48 hours to go. And I think it was pretty clear to both of us that picture, whatever reservations Churchill did have, and we will go on to talk about those, that picture was far too simplistic.
Yeah.
And so, that really set us on the path of this investigation.
Yeah.
Well, what was the role that Churchill
Yeah, that's
played?
very, very
It's
clear.
the inside story.
Yeah.
Yes, the inside story indeed. So before I come on to kind of the detail of the content of the book, most authors are single authors. They write a book on their own. And so obviously we have the two of you writing this book. And I wondered if you could reveal to us if you disagreed on any points, and if you could comment on how easy it was to co-author a book.
Well, I think the important thing is that we were agreed what the purpose was, and we've just been discussing the purpose. And clearly, Allen being the director of the Archives Centre, had access to a lot of material. So using material was an important part. But then, of course, we had to place it in its overall historical context, which is where I think we then worked together. We decided really what the chapter structure should be. I think the only debating point was what tense we were going to write the book in. There was a view, which I didn't share, that we'd write it in the present tense to make it more exciting, more immediate. But after discussion, we came to the conclusion that the past tense could also be immediate. And that, having had a little bit of a go at writing it in the present tense, we decided to write it in the past tense, and that actually is what we did.
This is all part of my wanting to strip away the layers of hindsight and plunge you back into the moment. But it didn't long survive the literary agents and the editors who quickly disabused me of this notion, quite rightly, because I think the book is much better. And actually, I did try writing one chapter in the present tense, and it's incredibly difficult.
But you make the point that, of course, we have the luxury, 80 years on, of knowing that D-Day, Operation Overlord, 6th of June 1944, worked. At the time, of course, they couldn't be as confident of that. An operation involving 150,000 people coming ashore from over 4,000 ships. The world has never seen an operation of that size, and I hope we never will, on the face of it. Seems extraordinarily unlikely. And so much could have gone wrong.
Yeah.
We can come back to that.
And I think we wanted to convey that sense of sort of complexity and difficulty, and give you a sense of what was coming into Churchill's dispatch box, what was crossing his desk, what were the decisions that he was having to make.
And it goes back to that earlier point we were saying, that in 1940, Britain stood alone, he was the Prime Minister, he could really call the shots in the way that he wanted. But through 41 to 44, with the extraordinary events of the Germans deciding to attack the Russians, bringing the Soviet Union into the war, the Japanese attacking the Americans at Pearl Harbor, brought the Americans into the war. Churchill then had to be in the position of managing Stalin and managing Roosevelt. And one of his great achievements was to persuade the Americans, who after all had been attacked by the Japanese, that the strategic objective of the alliance was the defeat of Germany first. You could have forgiven the Americans for thinking they want to again deal with the Japanese and then deal with the Germans later. On the other hand, Stalin was having to fight with all his might and main against the Wehrmacht pushing into Russia. And quite rightly, he was saying to Churchill, well, come on, where are the British soldiers fighting? Why are we taking all the heat? So he had to manage, on the one hand, the Americans, Germany first, on the other hand, to show to Stalin that we were serious about it, which was why, amongst many other reasons, we found ourselves drawn into North Africa, across North Africa, into Sicily and up Italy, all as precursors before, in 1944, and others would have liked it in 43 or even in 42, the assault on Europe was resumed.
Yeah. So we started to peel the layers back of the content of the book, but before we really delve into the strategic debates, which is what we really want to get onto in a moment, What's the main thing you wanted to get across in the book? And Richard, you've already started to describe that, but Alan, what was the key thing you wanted to...
I think the key thing was to show the complexity of D-Day, really. And as I say, to strip away those layers of hindsight, to actually to show events unfolding, and actually to show how difficult it is to undertake an operation of this scale against a heavily fortified coastline. And I think there were a number of things that surprised me when sort of writing the book. And one of the things I think was the sheer complexity on the political side, quite apart from the military side, which I think is one of the things that we do bring out in the book. Churchill isn't just dealing with the preparations for this huge military operation. He's having to handle the impact and the effect on that on the United Kingdom. You're talking about bringing over, ultimately, about 1.6 million US service personnel. That's not something that you can do overnight. That's something that's going to take time. You have to build the depots, the barracks, the airfields. You have to think about the supply chains, the munitions, all of this, the infrastructure of the country. What sort of strain is that going to put on the railways? And then you're going to have to manage some really quite difficult decisions about at what point do you lock down the UK ahead of the landings in France? Churchill has to decide when the south and east coasts are going to be sealed off. He has to decide when the border with Ireland is going to be closed. He has to decide...
I only smile because I was giving a talk on the book in Dublin 3 weeks ago, and when I made that point, well, no problem with us. We were really very helpful during all that. Yes, of course. I didn't mean it quite like that, actually.
But they had to judge that decision really very carefully because, of course, they had thousands of Irish labourers engaged in key wartime industries in the UK, actually producing some of the equipment that they're going to be needing for D-Day. If it looks as though they're going to close the border, the fear is all of those people will simply go home, up tools, and try and get back. So if you close that border too early, then you risk actually damaging your production. You also, of course, risk sending a signal to the enemy that the invasion is imminent.
It's hard to imagine how complex it was back then and the huge decisions that were being made.
I think while all the things that Alan was describing were going on, Churchill, as the British Prime Minister, had really worldwide responsibilities. The war in the Far East was developing and not developing well. He had to think about the relationship with Australia, New Zealand, Canada. And he also, being the sort of person that he was, had a great sense of history. I was on record in 1942 in a speech in the Mansion House saying I didn't become the King's first minister to preside over the dismemberment of the British Empire. So while all these things were going on to make D-Day happen to win the war, he was very conscious of Britain's position after the war and to make sure that we were a significant player on the world stage.
Yeah, he's having to think about the political situation, both before, during and after, as well as the military operations in a way that Eisenhower and Montgomery are not having to. And I think we'll come back to that later on.
Yes. Well, perhaps at this point we might delve more into some of the strategic debates which your book really kind of delves into. And in your opinion, was there one decision more than others that determined whether D-Day was successful or whether it actually failed? I think, Alan, you're going to
I'm going to kick off here.
First.
Of course, D-Day is made up of masses and masses of decisions over time. But ultimately, you can trace it back to a key decision, which is taken very early on, actually taken in April 1942. Because in April 1942, not long after Pearl Harbor, this letter arrives on Churchill's desk, hand-delivered by Harry Hopkins, President Roosevelt's emissary. So on White House paper, and it reads, "Dear Winston, What Harry and George Marshall will tell you all about has my heart and mind in it. Your people and mine demand the establishment of a front to draw off pressure on the Russians. And these peoples are wise enough to see that the Russians are today killing more Germans and destroying more equipment than you and I put together. Even if full success is not attained, the big objective will be, go to it. And then it ends, best of luck, make Harry go to bed early and let him obey Dr. Fulton, US Navy, whom I'm sending with him as super nurse with full authority. In other words, don't keep Harry Hopkins up drinking, because Hopkins' health was fairly bad. But this letter from, and signed at the bottom as ever FDR, this letter from President Roosevelt was accompanied by a secret memorandum. And that secret memorandum was the initial American plan drawn up by Marshall and Eisenhower, which was recommending immediate operations in France. Initially quite small-scale raids and operations while they built up troops in the United Kingdom, but with a view to then launching a major operation. However, that was the last thing that Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff were able to countenance at that point. We'd just lost Singapore, we'd just lost Hong Kong, we were fighting already in North Africa, we're hopelessly overstretched. Air Chief Marshal Portal says in one of the Defence Committee meetings that if the RAF has to fight over Europe unsupported, it will be destroyed within a matter of months. And the American plan makes clear that the Americans won't be in Europe in sufficient numbers until April 1943. So are you really going to say that you're going to sit back and do nothing but small-scale raids against France while building up forces in the UK, while the Russians are bearing these huge losses on the Eastern Front? For all these reasons, for Churchill, that was unacceptable.
And this is where the pushback in history, in a sense, has its origin as far as Churchill is concerned. Yes, we know it happened in 1944. We know the Americans wanted to go as early as 42 or 43. But Churchill had considerable experience in disasters in the past. He had been the First Lord of the Admiralty 1915, 1916 at the time of the Dardanelles. He was First Lord of the Admiralty again in early 1940, and it was his idea of what became the Norwegian campaign and the Narvik campaign, and he had to resign on both occasions. And of course, the supreme irony was that it was the debate in the House of Commons in May 1940 when he had the task of having to defend the government in regard to the failure in Norway that actually resulted in him becoming Prime Minister. And that really only came about because while that debate was going on, the Germans attacked in May, June into France, and the whole context changed, and out of that he became Prime Minister. But he was determined to learn the lessons of the failure of the Dardanelles, the failure of the Norway campaign. Indeed, when I ran the High Commander Staff course at the Army Staff College in Camberley years ago, the two case studies that we used to discuss how not to run a campaign like this were the Dardanelles and Norway. Right. And quite rightly, he drew certain lessons, and they were carried forward in his contribution towards the higher level thinking into what became Overlord. And just in passing, of course, as Alan has said, the Dieppe raid in 1942 was an attempt to see if the Allies could seize a German-held port on the coast of France. And it was a disaster, a bloody disaster, which the Canadians paid heavily for. And that led to one of the major decisions that when it came to Overlord, or what became Overlord, the assaults would have to be across the beach, the logistics would have to come across the beach. The impossibility of trying to capture a port just wasn't there. Hence we get into Churchill supporting the Mulberry Harbours, Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean to bring the fuel, and all those things. And as Alan has said, as the British Prime Minister, he was in the position of authority to craft the whip and say, we've really got to do these things. This is industrial projects of huge scale. Make sure the resources are there. Let's get it done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I thought it was interesting to show this particular slide in this place because all of the college members gathered here will recognise the portrait that I'm showing. This is the portrait of Churchill by Sir William Orpen, done in 1916, just after he'd sort of lost office over the Dardanelles crisis, and after he'd been commanding a battalion on the Western Front. And obviously, very sombre portrait, sort of dark, stark, black background. You've got the sort of bags under Churchill's eyes. It shows him at a moment really of enormous pressure. But I think, just following up on what Richard said, it's interesting to look at what are the lessons that Churchill learned from the Dardanelles. And I think one of the lessons that he learned was that if you were going to attempt something of that complexity and something of that scale, then you needed to be in charge. That's the lesson he took away. Others might have looked at it very differently. And that, of course, meant that when he comes back as wartime Prime Minister in May 1940, he's very quick to make himself not just Prime Minister, but also Minister of Defence, so that the Chiefs of Staff are reporting directly into him, not through the First Lord of the Admiralty or through the Secretary of State for War and Air. And it's making sure that he has a grip not just over the political operations, but also the military operations as well. That, of course, is also a reason why he gets frustrated, I think, in the run-up to D-Day itself. Because unlike 1940, by the time you get to 1944, he is in less control of the military operations. The military operation is now being led by Eisenhower, who's reporting in to the combined Chiefs of Staff. And Churchill's ability to influence the military affairs is less, and he doesn't like that.
And he's aware that certain preconditions have got to be met before it was right to contemplate the operation and very much affecting the timing. As this picture shows, that's the schematic of the landings themselves. But he knew, for example, and Alan's already alluded to the fact that so many Americans have got to come from the United States to this country across the Atlantic, so therefore the Battle of the Atlantic had to be won. Churchill himself chaired the U-boat committee to make sure that there was an absolute focus on that. He also knew that we had to weaken the enemy, so mastery of the air was extraordinarily important. And as Alan has said, the Royal Air Force knew they couldn't do it on their own, but once the Americans were in, and were in numbers, and the United States Army Air Force was here bombing by day, Royal Air Force Bomber Command bombing by night. And a whole range of things had to be done, and he had to make sure that he orchestrated those to get those preconditions right, to make sure that he gave the military the best chance of success.
Alan, did you want to expand on the preconditions?
Yeah, I think so. We talked a little bit about why D-Day was never going to work in 1942 and why that was completely unrealistic. But it then, I suppose, raises the question, well, why does it take until June 1944? And that's something we spend quite a lot of time looking at in the book, and it does tie to all of these preconditions, because all of these things take time. It takes time to win the Battle of the Atlantic. It takes time to obtain mastery of the skies over Europe, to wear the enemy down. It also takes time, I think, to embed the integration that you need between the British and American and Canadian and imperial forces. From the President and the Prime Minister down, it takes time to build up that international and inter-service cooperation. Very quickly, Churchill and Roosevelt agree that they're going to have the combined Chiefs of Staff, but they then have to thrash out their strategy through a large number of international conferences which take place through 1943 and early 1944. And then at the lower level, of course, you've got British troops now serving under American commanders and vice versa. They agree that whoever has the most troops in a particular theatre will have the overall command. But initially, there are all sorts of rivalries and suspicions that that have to be overcome. So that has to be built up, and of course it's much easier to test that against the much less heavily defended shorelines in North Africa and Sicily. And that's where the sort of D-Day team of Eisenhower, Ramsey, Montgomery, this is where they come together and where they develop the tactics and the technology which they then need to take into Normandy. But Normandy is always going to be a much, much harder proposition.
I think we also have to remember, we tend to think of the Americans having a large army, a large navy, a large air force. But in 1940, 1941, that didn't exist at all. They had to grow a large army. They had to grow a large air force. They had to make tremendous amounts of aircraft and tanks and all the rest of it, and also gain experience. And that's why the North Africa campaign, particularly the latter part of it, was really important. When Operation Torch, the 8th Army under Montgomery was advancing in one direction and the Americans landed in the other direction. They got a bloody nose at Kasserine Pass, but it was important that they then learned lessons. And so therefore there had to be a developing and a learning process by both the British and the Americans, and coming together, integration of air, land and sea. Yeah. A lot to be done in a very short period of time to even contemplate an operation of this size.
And there are all sorts of practical elements of that. I mean, it takes time to actually build up and assemble the required number of landing ships and the different types of landing ships, because you need different types of landing ships for tanks, for troop carriers, for infantry, for artillery. So, you've got to assemble all of that, but then you've got to train the crews and develop the tactics, because if you're releasing a force to land on a beach, and Richard, I'm sure you can comment far more eloquently than I on this, you can't have your, you want to make sure that your tanks and your infantry are basically arriving at more or less the same time. What you don't want is for your infantry to arrive very, very early and then to be machine gunned in the beach and run down by your own tanks. You don't want your own tanks to be lost at sea because they've been sort of set adrift far too early. So there are all these sorts of complicated tactics that have to be developed.
And I think we should also focus for a little while on deception.
Yeah.
Absolutely critical. The Germans knew, as time went by, that the Allies would attack on the coast of Europe. Of course, what they didn't know, and must not have known, was where and when. And therefore, very detailed deception plans were extraordinarily important. And the fake, fictitious first US Army group under Patton was modelled in the sort of area of Dover and Folkestone to give the impression that the main attack was going to come across the Pas de Calais onto that part. And that was extraordinarily successful. And as Churchill was quoted as saying, the truth is so important, it's got to be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. And the deception, the amount of effort that went into deception was huge and very successful, because it was not for about 3 weeks that Hitler could be persuaded that the main attack had occurred in Normandy and that he could release the armoured troops, much to the frustration of von Rundstedt and particularly the frustration of Rommel, Rommel particularly was terribly keen to defeat the attack on the beaches and was very frustrated that, frankly, when it came to it, 21 Panzer Division was about the only Panzer Division that he was allowed to use. But I'm jumping ahead slightly.
I mean, you're absolutely right to mention deception and how effective the deception was. Although one thing that did surprise me in writing this book is how sometimes they would use code names that were not particularly deceptive. So, Churchill at the Tehran conference says the truth is so precious that she must be protected by a bodyguard of lies. What do they then call the deception plan for the D-Day invasions? They call it bodyguard.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Actually, Tehran conference, of course, there's a lovely vignette also in the book when Churchill, sitting talking with Stalin and Roosevelt, said that there was I sitting next to the Russian bear and the American buffalo, and I was the little English donkey, the only one who knew the way home. Such was his confidence, but he also realized that actually the big boys were the Soviet Union and the Americans. But he was supremely confident that he knew the way home.
Very good. So what I'd like to do now is really turn to discuss Churchill the man. I'd like to get your thoughts on what Churchill was really most worried about in the weeks and days before D-Day, and how did he deal with those worries?
Okay. Well, to my mind, Churchill is a sort of man of action. If he's awake, he has to be doing something. If it's not sort of politics, then it's writing. If it's not writing, it will be painting or bricklaying. But he has to be active. And he loves nothing more than being at the sort of centre of the fray, the centre of the action. What he finds really difficult, I think, is when that's taken away from him and when he has to wait. And I think he finds the first few months of 1944 incredibly difficult. He's not particularly well. He comes very close to death in North Africa at the end of 1943, just after the Tehran conference, when he collapses with pneumonia. His health doesn't really recover during that much during the first half of 1944. He's physically weak, but I think he's also anxious because he can't influence this sort of impending military operation. So he's casting around for ways to engage, constantly sort of prodding the military commanders, demanding to know numbers of frontline troops versus support vehicles, sort of complaining about the number of bureaucrats who might be going in to Normandy.
Shortly before D-Day, Churchill was invited by Montgomery to his headquarters for a final briefing. And Churchill started to criticise the number of vehicles that were going to be deployed early on. And this really irritated Montgomery. And they had quite a row in his office, such that when Montgomery and Churchill went out to have officers with the rest of the to have dinner with the rest of the officers in the headquarters, Churchill said, "Good evening, gentlemen, but I'm not allowed to talk to you." But I think going on from there, as we got closer to D-Day, as he got closer to D-Day, as Allen says, he really wanted to be as involved as possible. He wanted to be as close to Montgomery's headquarters, as close to Eisenhower's headquarters, to be able to visit as many units as he could, such that eventually he decided to move his private office to a train on a siding at Droxford. And that's where he wanted to operate from. Fine, in principle, except the British Prime Minister's office in this train on the siding in Droxford was connected to the outside world by a single telephone line plugged into the local exchange. Totally impractical. And just as an aside, on the Sunday before D-Day, General de Gaulle came to have lunch with him, and they fell out spectacularly during the course of that lunch, such that actually Churchill was minded, but didn't in the end, but was minded to order de Gaulle to go back to his headquarters in North Africa. But these are all symptomatic of the fact that he really wanted to be in on the action, which of course leads us to the...
Well, can I say one thing
Yes,
before you get to that? Because I know where you're going. But I think while we're still talking about sort of Churchill's concerns and worries, there were a few specific things that were really worrying him in the run-up to D-Day. One you've just touched on, which is the rather complex relationship with de Gaulle, and it sort of Churchill was caught really between Roosevelt and de Gaulle. President Roosevelt was refusing to recognise de Gaulle as the effective leader of France post the invasion. Therefore, de Gaulle was saying, well, if I'm not going to be recognised, I'm not going to cooperate. And Churchill gets caught right in the middle of that. But there's also another debate, which is less well known, I think, which we feature in the book, which dominates an awful lot of time in the Defence Committee and in the War Cabinet in the weeks immediately preceding D-Day. And that's a huge debate about the bombing of France ahead of the D-Day operation. And Eisenhower and the military commanders, they draw up a bombing plan. And that bombing plan is predicated on disrupting as much of the German communication network as possible. And they think the most effective way of doing that is to target in particular the marshalling yards, the French railway marshalling yards. Now the problem you've got is that those marshalling yards, of course, are inevitably largely located in very dense areas of civilian population. And Churchill and some of the politicians in the War Cabinet become very worried that this is going to lead to thousands of French civilian casualties immediately before D-Day. And their worries are twofold, really. Firstly, that in the short term, what that's going to lead to is the French civilian population not rising to support the Allied liberation. But in the longer term, they're worried that actually it may create a dull hatred within France of the Allies, and particularly of the British, who are conducting the night bombing, and that the result of that might be to damage Anglo-French relations after the war, and even possibly drive the French population towards communism.
Interesting. And I think, Richard, you have some more to say on this about
well, of course,
Churchill's behaviour in this
his enthusiasm was classic in that he ordered Admiral Ramsay to come up with a plan whereby he, Winston Churchill, would embark on HMS Belfast overnight and witness the bombardment on Gold Beach, and then disembark via a destroyer later in the day and go and visit the beaches. And he put the idea to the king and suggested that the king came along as well. The king's private secretary, Tommy Lascelles, was extremely against this. And eventually, as this letter shows, the king had to write to his prime minister and say, Winston, you are not going. Mm-hmm. And he didn't actually get across to Normandy until 5 days later.
And the king didn't have to write just once. It's actually two letters. The first one here, 31st of May, 1944. The second one had to be hand-delivered to Churchill on his train by motorbike dispatch rider on the 2nd of June. So they were getting really close, and he was still insisting he was going to go. But on receiving the second letter, he grudgingly deferred to Your Majesty's wishes and indeed commands.
And of course, all that we're saying, all the planning was coming together on the chosen date of the 5th of June. But of course, the one thing that no planning could control was the weather. Mm-hmm. And as we all know, famously, the attack was postponed from the 5th of June to the 6th of June. This also had a very interesting effect on the Germans. The Germans' weather forecasting wasn't quite as good as Group Captain Stagg's weather forecasting. And the Germans came to the conclusion that the Allies would not attack on this day. Rommel went back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The officers of 7th Army, German 7th Army, met in Rennes to have a study day on their counter-invasion plans, and the commander of 21st Panzer Division took the opportunity to go to Paris to have a night with his mistress. So they were surprised that we actually came when we did on the 6th of June, which of course neatly runs into the concerns that Churchill had. Go back to the Dardanelles, go back to the First World War, when he wrote to Clementine, his wife, do you realise by the time you wake up in the morning, 20,000 men may have been killed? Well, we know with the benefit of hindsight that that didn't happen. But of course, the campaign itself was more than just the 6th of June, 1944. It ran right through June and July into August until the Allies successfully crossed the Seine and liberated Paris. And during the course of that, 20,000 men didn't die on D-Day, but by the end of the campaign, 22,442 men and women under British command had died during the course of the campaign.
Mm-hmm. Which actually brings us on to, as we begin to close this conversation, Richard, would you like to just describe this short video, which is on the Normandy Memorial? So we're going to show a short video of this in a moment, but would you like to introduce it?
Well, that point that I've just made is really the genesis of this. That, yes, there weren't 20,000 killed on D-Day, but there were a very large number of people killed during the Normandy campaign. And what many of the surviving veterans could never get their head around, why, given the significant role that Britain had played in this campaign, there was no British National Memorial. And it was on the 70th anniversary, 10, 11 years ago, that a number of veterans got hold of Nicholas Witchell, BBC Royal Correspondent, who was covering the 70th anniversary for the BBC, and said, why is it that we haven't got a national memorial? Cut a long story short, and much to Nick Witchell's credit, he gathered a number of people together, took the initiative in launching the Normandy Memorial Trust, such that 10 years later, 50 acres of French soil having been bought from 8 different landowners, that's a comment on French land ownership, never mind, £27 million later, on the 6th of June last year, His Majesty the King was able to preside over British Memorial commemoration at the new British Memorial, of which this short video gives a bit of the background to.
Thank you, so we'll play that.
To us is given the honour of striking a blow for freedom which will live in history. And in the better days that lie ahead, men will speak with pride of our doings.
We lucky ones, we got off, but you'd left a lot of mates behind. And you never forget them. When you come back here, you can see their faces. And of course, they'll never be older. We still see them, 18, 19, 20-year-olds.
Oh, I think it's ideal. Fantastic. There's the beach there. Gold Beach as well. Ideal spot. Couldn't wish for better.
Absolutely good idea.
Good idea. We do.
It's long overdue.
I can't even visualise this as it was all those years ago. I think it's a wonderful position. Marvellous. It's peaceful too.
I feel that if I don't achieve this to the very best, highest standard, I will have let those people down.
We owe our freedom to our veterans. And whatever it takes, we will never surrender. And whatever it takes, we will always stand together.
I'm no hero. I was lucky. I'm here. All the heroes are dead. And I'll never forget them as long as I live.
May I ask the British Ambassador to France, Lord Llewellyn, to open formally the British Normandy Memorial on my behalf.
We will always remember and always be proud how you did your job, as you always so modestly put it, and now we must do ours. We must defend the beachhead you won at such a cost. With humility and with great pride, I declare the British Normandy Memorial open.
I'm delighted with the result. To see it now, in the form that it's in, it's beyond belief and beyond my dreams. I never thought it would be like this, but I'm so delighted it is.
I'm delighted. I'm filled with wonder at what they achieved here. 22,442 men remembered on these monuments. And wonderful men they are.
So that memorial was constructed to commemorate that number of 22,442 men and women who lost their lives in the campaign. And that's important that we do commemorate those who fought and fell. But also what the Normandy Memorial Trust feels very strongly is that it's really important that we educate successive generations, particularly of children. So last year, over the previous 18 months, we built the Winston Churchill Centre for Education and Learning, which His Majesty the King and Her Majesty the Queen opened on the 6th of June this year, really to tell the story, and particularly important, as Alan alluded to earlier on, of the British role in Operation Overlord. It's too easy to think of Saving Private Ryan, to think of the American influence, but Winston Churchill, probably who we're talking about, his role was extraordinarily important. Montgomery, the overall land commander, in the initial phases. So the Winston Churchill Centre is there to tell the story for future generations. There is a picture which we haven't got here of the opening on the 6th of June. I made a little bit of a speech as chairman of the Normandy Memorial Trust and said to the King and the Queen, there's a cloth over the plaque, if you could just flip it up. Well, the King flipped and the Queen pulled. Fortunately, the plaque didn't come off the easel, but it's open and it's there. And so if you do go and visit this year, the Winston Churchill Centre there is by the memorial, and I think it's absolutely fitting that we are remembering all those who fought and fell and the story behind the Normandy campaign.
Indeed.
And we're hopeful that some of our materials are going to be going into it.
Indeed,
yeah.
Indeed.
Very good. Well, look, thank you both so much for these fascinating insights. I found it electrifying, actually, to listen to you speak, and it feels like it really brings it to life. It's like it almost yesterday when you speak. So we have got some time now for the audience to ask some questions. If you'd like to raise your hands, and please say your name and affiliation before you ask your questions, so that gives us a little bit of context. And we've got some roving mics as well, so Mark at the front.
Mark Holmes, I'm a fellow here in Churchill. I've really enjoyed, but I haven't actually got to the end yet, I have to confess. But I was interested in, did you identify any novel sources or able to utilise any previously overlooked resources? Or if there aren't any of those, what were the main resources that you really made, this come alive?
That's a great question. Obviously, there is a wealth of material in the Churchill archives here, and particularly in Churchill's own papers. Now, of course, plenty of scholars have been through those, but one of the things that we've been able to do in recent years is to fully catalogue and digitise those papers, which makes it much easier to sort of search across them and sort of find new nuggets. And certainly, David Reynolds, who's a professor here in Cambridge, many of you will know of him, he wrote a wonderful book, In Command of History, about Churchill's writing of the history of the Second World War. And of course, that then opens up all sorts of material, not just in Churchill's political files, but also in the literary files. We were able to go through a lot of material from the National Archives. I was also lucky enough to get into Windsor Castle and the Round Tower there, which isn't always the easiest thing to do, and to look at the King's correspondence with Churchill. And again, that led to us being able to tell the story of the King's argument with Churchill over whether or not Churchill should go to the beaches from both sides. There's also, of course, a wealth of memoir material out there. And one of the things I think we wanted to do to bring this alive was to juxtapose the grand strategy and what Churchill is dealing with the experiences of some of the people who were responsible for actually delivering that in different roles. So we follow the progress of various individuals and their roles throughout the book.
And I think if you read the book, you can see exactly what Alan is saying there. There are individual stories that are woven in amongst the strategic discussions. Company Sergeant Major Stan Hollis, 6th Battalion of Green Herds, coming ashore, sees something on the beach, looks like a pillbox, grabs a Lewis gun, gives it 2 drums of ammunition, storm up the beach, and they find it's just the shelter for the local light railway. Little vignettes and issues like that, which we can sort of have tried to draw in to give it colour as well as the big story.
And I can see Barry in the audience, and I was very keen to work in the Churchill College art collection. So we featured not just the William Orpen portrait of Churchill, but the book actually ends with mention of the Lursa tapestry in the library, which, if you haven't seen it, you should go and have a look. It was General de Gaulle's gift to Churchill College. As a gift, I think there was probably nothing that was more likely to annoy Churchill than the legend which is sewn into the fabric in the top left-hand corner, where basically you've got a little image of the Arc de Triomphe with the legend underneath, Paris liberated itself.
Just like that.
Yes, just like that. Thank you. Another question. Gentleman at the front, thank you.
Very uplifting talk. Thank you very much. I hate to lower the tone a little bit, but I just would like a question to Lord Dannatt about the fighting quality of the British Army, because that was something that worried Churchill a great deal. The Germans were superb soldiers. The Russians were killing Germans, 80% of battlefield casualties that the Germans suffered from the Russians. And Churchill clearly had great worries about the fighting quality of the British Army. And it's interesting in the context of Putin saying that the British Army now wouldn't fit into wouldn't fill Wembley Stadium. I wonder if you'd like to comment on this particular aspect. I'm not trying to knock the heroism of the people who fought, but I do think that Churchill's worry about that was something quite fundamental.
No, you ask a really important question there, and of course it was said, you can win every debate in the House of Commons, but actually your soldiers are losing every battle. Yeah. I think you've got to put this in a wider context. The British Army, and the British Armed Forces, but the Army in particular, was extraordinarily unprepared in the late 1930s. It was very, very small. The legacy of the First World War, horrific casualties, 888,246. That was the number of poppies in the moat in the Tower of London, one for every British and Commonwealth soldier who had lost their lives. That had to be the war to end wars. So in the 1920s and 1930s, the army got back to normal soldiering, which was policing the empire and looking after. And there was no focus on preparing, and there was a 10-year rule that said there would be no major war in Europe for 10 years, and that rolled on year after year. Defence cuts were huge, the army's numbers shrunk. There wasn't even much intellectual thinking within the army. There were one or two who tried to experiment rather more with the tank and aircraft and so on, but they were drowned out. So the army that found itself being deployed to France in 1939 was, frankly, an unprepared army, and it had to learn on the hoof through the disasters of May-June 1940, evacuation from Dunkirk. We all know the story about Dad's army and all the rest of it. Most of the army's equipment had been lost. The army had to be rebuilt before it was capable of starting operations in North Africa, gain more experience. Eventually, Montgomery in command, learning on his lessons from the First World War. He was not a risk taker. He didn't want to start Second Alamein until he had enough guns, enough tanks, enough ammunition to make sure he was going to win. Much the same as far as Overlord was concerned. He didn't want to start until he was confident he was going to win. So the British Army had to learn just at the same time the American Army was being put together. So we know that eventually we succeeded. On VE Day, 80 years on, we're going to celebrate on the 8th of May this year. But it was a jolly hard 5 or 6 years of fighting and learning and losing until we eventually, the tide turned after Second Alamein and we began to win battles. Prior to that, we'd been losing them.
And just to pick up on that, you can see this in the documents, and we do cover it in the book. I mean, it is a recurring concern of Churchill's inner circle. Can our army fight? You see it after Singapore in early 1942, and it's clearly one of the reasons why it takes time to get to 1944. You need time to build up your forces, you need time to train your forces, but you also need to develop morale, and that is also something we touch on.
Very good, thank you. Another question, perhaps on that side.
Christopher Catherwood, former Archives Byfellow. One of the interesting things about the book is that you don't start in 1944, a lot of books on D-Day do. You actually go back in time. And of course, one of the big changes to which you both alluded is that Churchill was the big hitter, if you like, in 1940. But in 1944, he wasn't. And this was a very interesting change. It was how difficult was it for Churchill to realise that he was the little British donkey with the Russian bear and the American buffalo? That wonderful quote of the letter he wrote to Violet Asquith. talking about his experiences at Tehran. It was a learning curve, but how difficult a learning curve was it, and how much difference did it make to how he dealt with the issues around D-Day?
Yeah, okay, I'll have a crack at that. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that it's clearly an incredibly difficult thing for him to realise about himself. This, after all, is someone who had famously described himself early on in his career at an Edwardian dinner party by turning to Violet Asquith, the daughter of the Prime Minister, and saying, "My dear, we are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." And Churchill has an incredible self-belief, a self-confidence. As you heard from Richard earlier, in 1942, he's still saying, "I haven't become the King's First Minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." He is fighting to try and maintain that empire, to return to the world of 1939. But although he doesn't want to recognise that, and although I think he knows that because of the role that he's played in 1940 and 41, he has a sort of a certain standing and a certain cachet that he can cash in. I think towards the end of the war in 44, 45, he is finding it increasingly difficult. It's not just his physical health that's failing, it is the pressures of the sort of post-war world and the increasing realisation that it is going to become more and more difficult to maintain the British position that he wants to maintain. And I mean, that's pretty clear a few weeks after D-Day, where at the point at which there are suddenly more American forces involved in Europe than there are in British. It's pretty clear to him when the Americans say, "Well, we're going to go into the south of France, you're going to have to halt operations in Italy." And it's even more clear to him, I think, by the time you get to the summer of 1945, when he asks the British Chiefs of Staff to draw up plans for a limited offensive against the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, which they call unthinkable, Operation Unthinkable, because it clearly is, by that point, unthinkable.
Yes, and I think also it's worth reflecting on the fact that by 1945, he was exhausted.
Yep.
And of course, I think he did the right political thing by wanting to return the country to normal democracy and by holding a general election. He was so exhausted that he didn't really campaign very effectively himself, and was shattered that his Conservative Party did not win the election and didn't just lose it. I mean, they lost it famously, I mean, really rather like last year, with the Labour Party winning a very large majority. For Clementine, it was the best thing that could possibly happen, because it meant he was no longer Prime Minister, and frankly, he could start to recover. And as we all know, it was 5-6 years before he became a peacetime Prime Minister.
Well, she said, of course, that it was a blessing in disguise, to which he's supposed to have responded, "It's certainly effectively disguised to me."
And that's a very good way to wrap up this session. So I know that there were many people with their hands up, but we will have we're going out to the buttery in a moment, where we'll have a reception, and you'll be able to talk to Allen and Richard there. I just think this has been an extraordinary session this evening. There are 24 copies of this book behind the buttery bar. So if you'd like to sign one, buy one.
You can sign it if you want.
Yes, if you'd like to sign one, but if you'd like to buy one, there are 24, so I'm sure they'll go like hotcakes. And but I would like to thank you both, Allen and Richard, for really an extraordinary First Masters Book Club today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.